As we're finding out now, the saying, "May you live in interesting times," is most certainly a blessing and a curse. We're facing climate catastrophe, hurricanes that are bigger, wetter, and more frequent, social upheaval with the return of demons that we thought we had vanquished, with racism and sexism, and even more pervasive, an all-out war on the poor by the few. There's an opioid crisis that is killing more people per year than guns or car crashes or even HIV/AIDS. 72,000 people died in 2017, according to the CDC. That's almost 200 a day. And that's a man-made crisis. And all these crises we're facing, that 72,000 people who died last year due to opioids, mostly prescribed to them, amounts to more people than were killed in all military engagements in Vietnam and Iraq. That's more than all of the people we lost in those two conflicts combined in just 1 year. And speaking of man-made catastrophes like war, we are currently facing an endless cycle of wars. We've been in Afghanistan for 17 years. That's the longest war that we've ever had in American history. And that war is directly contributing to the opioid crisis and to other crises we're facing here. Speaking of endless war, we're also contributing to the worst genocide that maybe the world has ever seen, and it's relatively speaking silent. The people of Yemen are being absolutely decimated in what amounts to the siege of an entire country. The siege of a city or a town is a war crime. What does it amount to when it's an entire country that is being blockaded, surrounded, and systematically bombed and starved into oblivion? And I'll add that it's being done with our money and operational assistance. Let me say that again. Your tax dollars are going towards destroying an entire country. We're also seeing the rise of fascism. And I don't mean fascism as an insult. I don't mean it in a rhetorical sense. I don't mean it simply as a way to get people's attention. I mean literal, actual fascism. The kind that we thought we would never see in our lives, or that we thought couldn't possibly happen in America. At least I didn't when I was growing up, and I'll be the first to admit that. But what is fascism? It's a merger of state and corporate power. It's a rise of extreme nationalism, usually coupled with racism and xenophobia. It's the slow encroachment of human rights and civil rights, both for people within our own country and especially for those who we view as others from outside of our own country. People keep wondering and keep saying, when are we going to reach a constitutional crisis? Are we in a constitutional crisis? When do we know when we're in trouble? I'm going to tell you, we should have realized how much trouble we were in the very second that our current president put his children in positions of power and gave them high-level security clearance and allowed them to sit in for him at meetings globally. This is not a monarchy. These are unelected individuals. If there is any stronger case for the fact that we are already in a time of crisis, that should have been it. We're facing the end of pretty much everything we've known within our lives. That means also many of our heroes being taken down, exposed as frauds, or even worse, abusers. People who we thought had our best interests at heart, or who were to be role models, are falling day after day. We're facing the end of innocence. As a child growing up, we knew, obviously, that America was the best country in the world, that it was the place that you could come to for freedom and for the best possible chance at life. And while to an extent that may have been true, we didn't realize that for every American who was able to escape poverty, for every immigrant who was able to come here and escape the poverty they had left, there were hundreds or thousands of people whose station was being lowered as a result. America's a fantasy. It's a dream. It's a fairy tale, and it's one that we're all currently waking up from. Friends, we are definitely in the last days. Now, when I say the last days, let's not get it confused. I don't mean biblically or something like that, as if we're going to be going into the time of revelations in the Christian Bible. What I'm talking about is we are definitely in the last days of all of the systems that we've known. We're in the last days of this particular world and way of living. For a lot of reasons, that's a good thing. The first thing to realize, though, is that we are in a lot of trouble. We're in constant peril day after day. And this is not a new trouble or peril, especially for those of us who've been on the bottom. Now, who am I talking about? Who is this podcast for? Recently, there was a Reuters survey which said that 70% of Americans support Medicare for all. Now, this isn't just simply some sort of partisan talking point or left-right discussion. This is 70% of all Americans. And it's these people who I'm talking to. Because let's face it, the left, right, and Democrat, Republican, that whole false duality of America, that should have long been exposed as a lie. Because it clearly is. Left and right don't mean anything, because if you ask any individual what they believe, you're going to get a spectrum of opinions out of each individual. You might get someone who believes strongly in guns, but also believes strongly in rights for all people. And those two things are, not only are they not in conflict, they actually, in my opinion, go right together. But we'll save that for another time as well. We have been lied to. We have been constantly and egregiously lied to. We've been lied to by our parents, by our churches, by our schools, and especially by the news. Here's something interesting. There's a reason that our current president and previous dictators before him have been able to call on the news as being fake media. It's because state-controlled corporate media doesn't tell the people the things they need to fight against their own continued enslavement. That enslavement might not be literal, though it far too frequently is, because let's face it, how many things can you do without a permit, or without a license, or without the right amount of money? Think about that. How many things can you do without some form of permission? This is where libertarians get it right. There's not that much you can do in this world that's actually free. And by free, I mean just the ability to, as a living, breathing being on this planet, to go out and interact with the planet on which you were born, to make your own way and secure your own survival. It's just not possible, especially if you're born in a city, but usually if you live elsewhere, even if you live in rural places, there are laws in many places against collecting rainwater, and you need the right permits to hunt and to fish and where and when you can actually produce your own food. These are the kind of laws we don't think about, but they're the laws that most egregiously impinge upon our freedom as living creatures. If you can't interact with the world around you in a free and natural way, what kind of freedom or liberty do you really have? I would argue approaching none. And then you add to that the other systems that don't affect everyone, systems like sexism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia. These are all systems that can be directed against smaller and smaller groups of people, and altogether too frequently are. These systems are a trap, and they're used to keep people separate so that we don't see that from the beginning, none of us are really free. And to take that further, what we allow to happen to someone who lives under the same laws as we do, we will eventually get a taste of. Even if you don't think it involves you right now, those people are just a testing grounds. I'm going to give you an example of that right now. The Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy movement. How many of us saw during the Occupy movement footage, either a picture or video, of riot police spraying tear gas directly into the faces of peaceful protesters, some of whom were already cuffed, and certainly none of whom were presenting a threat? I'm sure we all saw that. Most of us did nothing, some of us laughed. But that should have been a warning to us, what's possible. Anything that can happen to someone in this country could happen to you if you allow it. The Black Lives Matter movement. That has been a spontaneous response to something that has been going on since this country started. I actually think that it is a response to this country's original sin. But the long and short of it is that the Black Lives Matter movement is calling not just for the liberty of black people and for the safety of black people, but for changes to our criminal justice system, which would not allow any of our countrymen to have to suffer unjust treatment, vicious treatment. There's no reason that a person in a supposedly free society should have to give account for themselves when just going about their business on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that's asked of black people in this country, and that's something that maybe you aren't aware of. Especially if you live in the suburbs where you may not even have met a black person, and that's not your fault. No one's blaming you for that, because communities are built by the government and by people who have a lot more power than you or I. And redlining laws and laws that were intended to relegate certain, finger quotes, undesirable people to certain neighborhoods, those laws were not actually put there to protect white people. They're put there to protect white supremacy. And white supremacy does not protect white people. Let me repeat that. White supremacy does not protect white people. Because one of the things that Black Lives Matter seeks to do away with is extrajudicial killings of citizens. Now, black people are only 12 to 13% of the people in this country. So even though per capita, black people suffer much, much worse than white people do, a greater number of white people every year are killed by cops. And that's a talking point that the wrong people will use to discredit Black Lives Matter. But the truth of the matter is that the two things aren't separate. They're actually completely connected. And that's the point of Black Lives Matter. The point of Black Lives Matter is not that black people should get special treatment. It's that no one in this country should get a certain kind of treatment. And switching gears slightly, let's talk about another kind of unjust treatment. Women and femmes have been receiving unjust treatment for the longest time. It's hard to even say just how long it's been. And now with the Time's Up movement and the Me Too movement, we're seeing a little bit of the first stirrings of the end of that. The emancipation of half of humanity is a truly amazing thing. And it's something that has been so long in coming that it boggles the imagination to even think about just how much people have had to suffer for what amounts to a circumstance of their birth. I mean, just think about that. And I'm not talking about this from a lefty liberal standpoint. I just mean, think about this. If you're a male-bodied person, you can just walk down the street and go about your business. But if you're a woman or a female-bodied person, for at least your entire adult life, at some point you're going to have to deal with somebody invading your personal space, or at least your mind, with a bunch of energy that is directed at you sexually. That's weird, right? Can you imagine if you just were walking down the street and people felt the need to lob insults at you for just what to you was no reason? That's the world that women live in every day. One of the reasons I believe that trans women are treated so poorly by so much of society, death rates for trans women, especially black trans women, are just horrendous. One of the reasons for that is I believe that eschewing masculinity and taking on a mantle of greater femininity offends some people, because masculinity is viewed as the prize. That's what you seek. Because to take on greater femininity, well, that's to take on what has been associated with weakness and associated with a lesser status of a human being. And it's positively not only disgusting, but it's just nonsensical. We're talking about the humans that can actually bring other humans into the world. And of course, I'm not looking to separate the role that, both genders bring to the mix here, but only one. And we're sticking for the purposes of this conversation, we're just going to stick to XXXY. But by the way, intersex is completely a thing, and there are way more than two genders. Let's just get that out of there. But breaking it down just for the purposes of this conversation, humans are magical. And we've been forced to give away so much of our magic to get by in a system that does not care for any single one of us. Not even the people at the top who think it does. Because for them, it's killing something else. It's killing their hearts, it's killing their spirits. It's killing their ability to enjoy the one life that any of us is really ever going to know. Personally, I think that's why they become such monsters. It's because they've been cut off from the most simple joys because of the things that they've had to do. I know one example personally, but that's a topic for a different day. I've got a lot of those. But one of the reasons that I think people experience PTSD after war, it's not just the things they've seen or the horrible things that have happened around them. It's not just watching their friends dying or seeing a lot of human misery. The problem isn't the things they've seen, it's the things that they've done. I don't think that's something that a lot of us consider, especially because we live in the myth of American exceptionalism still. And a lot of us haven't gotten it in our heads that we're the bad guys, and we have been for a very long time. All the people in your family, all the people across this country who honorably signed up for the military, I got nothing but love for those people. But the fact of the matter is, they got sold a lie. And they got sent to do some atrocious things in countries thousands of miles away. They've been forced to do things that no one could really get over. Unless you're a deeply, deeply sociopathic person. And of course, there are conflicts in which we should have been involved, certainly. But certainly none of the big ones during our lifetimes. And to bring that back, one of the reasons that people with a certain amount of money become so monstrous is because they realize how that money got to them and what had to be done for them to get it. And that's got to not be a great feeling. Reports come out about the damage we do in other countries. We know just how many lives our luxuries cost. Maybe we don't all, but the more money you have, the more access you have to actual information, some of it firsthand. So who is this podcast for? I digressed for quite a while there. Going back to that 70% of people who believe in Medicare for all. Those are the people who know the meaning of society. Because what is a society if it's not a group that takes care of each other? That's got to be it. That's got to be the base. That's got to be the absolute ground floor of what society means. And I think for most of us, we can feel that. At least for 70% of us. We can get our heads around the fact that yes, there should be some sort of system that takes care of, at very least, the basic health of everyone within a society. And here's the thing, it's not only 70% of Americans, but in every developed country in the world. This is a talking point I'm sure you've heard from many politicians who are proponents of Medicare for all. But across the world, some sort of healthcare system which you don't have to pay into out of pocket every time is the absolute standard. And yet, in the most powerful and wealthy country the world has ever known, it's not a standard. It's viewed as something that is pie in the sky. So let's go back to those 70% of people who support Medicare for all. I think that understanding is a pretty simple way of getting at the fact that you just want to live, and you want the people around you to be able to live. I think that's all being a good person is. I don't really think it's that complicated. And that goes far beyond race or class or gender or anything. You know, if you're a person in the hood who's just trying to live, or if you're a redneck from West Virginia, or if you're a rich kid who grew up watching their parents and thinking there's something wrong with the way that we live in this wealth, anyone in the world who knows that taking care of someone else doesn't mean there's less for you. That's who this podcast is for. We're the ones that need to fix this. Because we all agree on the most basic thing, and it's that people should be permitted to live. And if we can, we help them. And we've been so removed from any sort of natural state and the ability to just interact with our world, that we have to be sure to protect each other within the world that we have now. If you are the kind of person who believes that, I'm with you. I don't care what your particular political ideologies are. I don't care if you are for abortion or against abortion. Though, of course, it must be said that that is a personal decision, not a religious one. If you want to go to the Bible says nothing about abortion except for a few things which are sort of pro-abortion, weirdly. But that's, I guess, a different topic for a different day. The long and short of it is, those of you who just want to live and let other people do their thing, and for them to have a safe and healthy chance to do it, that we're the people who are the future. One of the other things we're coming to the last days of is the lie. Because the imperial liberals or the neoliberals, they're basically the good cop to your MAGA hat wearer's bad cop. They're the ones who will say, I absolutely support Black Lives Matter, and I definitely would never do or say anything racist, and they'll use the right pronouns for their trans friends. But when it comes down to it, what do they actually do? These are the people that have decided in Brooklyn, in New York City, in one of the most supposedly liberal places in the world, that they're going to go to their school board and fight against desegregation. These are the kind of people who still to this day are slightly afraid of black people. But I had had many conversations with liberals where their first time at a rally or a protest for anything was the Women's March after the election of our current president. I'm going to go ahead and say that if your first time at a direct action or a protest of any variety was in 2017 and you're a grown-up, there's something very seriously wrong with your politics. People have been dying in the streets. The opioid crisis has been decimating this country. We've been drone bombing people in at least 7 or 8 countries without declaring war, without any sort of legal precedent, committing war crimes. And that didn't get you out of bed. But because you can see that some of the garbage we have been spreading all around the world might just wash up on your beach, now you're awake. Yeah, it sounds like I'm being harsh, and it's about time. Because we didn't get to this moment in isolation. America has always been a fascist country. I'm going to say that again. America has always been a fascist country, or at least has all the steps for fascism baked in. That might be hard to hear. Lots of people don't like to hear that the previous president did some extremely fascistic things. Exceedingly. And it's pretty difficult to argue that when, under the nation's first black president, the Black Lives Matter movement for the liberation of black people came into full swing. Something new's coming. I'm not talking about the biblical apocalypse. Not even necessarily a nuclear apocalypse. I mean the last days of everything that we've known. And that's hard to face. It's hard to even say. It's hard to think, but it's going to happen. It's happening now, and we can all feel it. We can all see it. The fiction that resonates with each time is generally a reflection of their greatest fears. There's a certain zombie show I'm certain we've all watched or at least heard of that to me really exemplifies where our fears are coming from. And not because of, not literally, it's not to be taken literally. It's the fear of death and destruction all around us, and there being no one who's coming to save us. To switch to something positive, what do we do? First, unity. I don't care what your beliefs are. I don't care who you are. You got to get over yourself. You and me both, all of us. If you're a white person and you're tired of hearing black people talk about how hard they have it, you got to get over yourself. Black people have it tougher than white people. Having said that, if you're a poor white person, I understand. I understand where you're coming from. I really, really do. Because for poor white people in this country, especially in the middle of the country and the forgotten places of this country, you have gotten an absolutely raw deal. Men, you got to get over yourselves. Women right now are finally getting to speak out about enduring miserable conditions for centuries. That's something we got to listen to. And you got to let people speak and have their turn to speak. And you got to listen to where their rage is coming from. Because the truth is, it all comes from the same place. We all have the same enemies. We all want the same things. And I think that's the truest thing that there is that any good people, we want the same things. We have to get out of our own way to get out of each other's way and stand together. All these movements are one movement. And we need that now. We're staring down the barrel of human extinction. That's not a hyperbole. Climate change alone is going to wipe us all out. The planet will be just fine, but our ability to live on it is going to be at an end if we don't reverse course immediately. And obviously, our government isn't going to do that. Both of our parties are bought. Both parties in the American system do not care about you. And miss me with any talk about how that's false equivalency. It's not false equivalency. Look at any vote for increased military spending. Those are bipartisan. One of the biggest contributors to climate change is the continued war effort, the production of war weapons, the use of war weapons. Here's the thing. We talk about single-use items all the time and how we need to stop using single-use straws and single-use forks, and that's absolutely true. But you know what else is single-use? A bomb, a bullet. These things are being produced with the express intent of them being used once to extinguish not only the product used, but a human life, somewhere where we can't see it, and for some ends that serve the American empire, but not the American people. So miss me with that talk about how they're not the same. Yes, your Democrats will be a little bit better when it comes to X, Y, or Z thing. But when it comes down to it, when the rubber really meets the highway, we need people who actually represent us. But that's a different topic for a different day as well. Let's talk about what we can do, we as individuals, without the need from anyone above. First of all, boycotts, where you spend your money. Now, there are many people who don't think boycotts work, and that's just fine. Strategically, I know that boycotts are supposed to be highly coordinated to be effective. But for me, it's not about what everybody else is doing. I don't need to wait for you to do it for me to stop shopping with Amazon. I see what they do. I see what they've done to Main Street. I live in New York City, and I've seen what Amazon has done to stores that have been in business for years. If you walk up and down the Upper West Side, there are empty stores, at least one every block, usually 2 or 3. On the Upper West Side, this is not a poverty-stricken area. right? It's not like you're walking down, driving through some town in Appalachia that's been forgotten. No, this is the Upper West Side. This is the belly of the beast. And yet, people who start businesses and have had them for 50 years can't afford to do it anymore. I've seen the stories about how Amazon treats their workers. And the whole $15 an hour thing, it's a dodge. And it's also the bare minimum they could do, considering how much of our money they're making. I don't need you to stop spending your money with Amazon for me to realize it's the right thing to do. And that should be the same thing for everyone. If you know a company's doing wrong, you know what you need to say? You can keep doing wrong, but know the fuck you're not going to do it with my money. Now, I understand there are some people that don't have the option of physically going to a store. Again, living in New York City, I have more options than many. But that's not the point. There are local artisans you can find. There are things you can do without. There are things you can get a different version of. There are also different companies which allow you to buy direct. Go to eBay. Go to some other place. Buy directly from the person you want to buy from online. Don't just go for the convenience of 2-day shipping to get around your morals. If your morals are worth 2-day shipping, I got news for you. You're in trouble. Don't spend your money with anyone who is contributing to things that you don't believe in. Because every dollar they get is one of our dollars. We are publicly funding corporations. That's something we don't think about. We're voting for corporations by spending our money with them. If we stopped doing that, they would have to change. They would have no choice. But we don't, because we're lazy. Time for that's over. Complicity is not a good look. Just remember that whenever you're about to spend money with a company like Amazon, think about what they're doing to America. What else we can do? Community involvement. Now, in rural and suburban places, maybe it's a little bit easier to get into these things because it's a little bit more part of the culture. But even and especially in cities, community involvement is vital. Whether it's stopping by a senior center or going to your block association meeting or your building association meeting or starting one if there's not one, going to the local community garden. We need to restore community involvement because that's the basis of everything. I remember during Hurricane Sandy, it was pretty clear that FEMA wasn't going to be doing anything for the people of the Rockaways in Breezy Point, at least not for some time, if they ever did. And it took the community. There was one community center where people just went and dropped off food and supplies, and people just showed up and they just did the work. And we do those things in times of crisis naturally because, like I said, 70% of us believe that everybody should be healthy and have a way to live, and we look out for each other. That's our natural state. That's the natural state of our hearts. That's the natural state of humanity. And that shit's beautiful. But we don't need to wait until it gets to a crisis point. And we shouldn't wait until it gets to a crisis point because that's often too late. Community involvement. Get to know your neighbors. How many of your neighbors do you know? If suddenly there was a storm or a catastrophe and people were out in your streets, if there was a blackout, which of your neighbors could you go to and say, hey, what's going on? Or do you need anything? Can I help you? Would you know their names? Get to know the people who live around you. Some celebrity whose Instagram you follow all the time is not going to help you in a crisis. As much as I also enjoy celebrity culture being an American, I understand that it's something that's been put on me, and celebrities are the stormtroopers of capitalism. We look up to them. We think that's where we're supposed to get. We think that's the pinnacle of life. We think that's what we're supposed to aspire to. But those people live a life that not only do we not necessarily want, we most certainly don't need. Before I get too far afield, let's keep on what we should do. Prepping. Now, you may have heard the term prepper used derisively. Some people view preppers as a lunatic fringe, and some of them take it a little too far, let's be honest. But the idea of prepping, that's just what people used to do. It just means preparing. That's all it means. Everyone should be a prepper, and everyone is a prepper to some degree or the other. If you have a savings plan, you're a prepper. If you have an insurance policy, you're a prepper. All these things are just ways we prepare. But the thing about preppers and the prepper community is that it has been sidelined and maligned because those people are looking for a way to prepare without the standard systems. They're just looking to take it into their own hands. And that's what we all should be doing. FEMA says you should keep on hand 3 days worth of food and water. That is just absolutely insufficient. Every person should have on hand at least a month's worth of food. Canned goods, whether it's freeze-dried, whatever it is, you should have a month's worth of food saved up. I know space is at a premium in New York City, but there are many ways around that. And speaking of getting to know your neighbors, if you know people that have space, friends who live nearby who have space, you can have them hold on to your physical goods. But the idea is that you should be prepared to take care of yourself in a catastrophe. Because when and if there is a big enough catastrophe, whether it's climate or otherwise, the government is not going to be able to adequately feed and house and save everyone. That's just a matter of simple math. And if you look back at previous catastrophes, the aforementioned Sandy or Katrina, and even the catastrophes that are going on now, there are plenty of people who have not seen $1 from FEMA, and their homes are still either full of water or burned by wildfires or something else terrible has happened, and they have been able to receive no redress and their lives are essentially ruined. That's why we have to be prepared. Start supporting independent media. Start supporting grassroots organizations. The smaller the organization and the more they need your money, the more they will be accountable to you. Don't worry about the Washington Post and the New York Times. They don't need your money to continue. Learn the old skills. Do you know how to sew? Do you know how to cook? Those are things that you'll always need to learn. Any skill that just involves interacting with the physical world and with the things that you need to survive is something that you should already have a strong command of how to do. And this is one thing that people who live in rural areas have head and shoulders above us city folk. These are things that they just have learned how to do and know how to do. And living in the city, we think that our next meal is always going to come from Seamless or from the deli down the block. Or if we need to get our clothes fixed, we just order some new ones, or we just go to the dry cleaner that happens to have a tailor in the place. But that's not really how it works. These are things we should know how to do. Growing food is the most important thing I can stress that everyone should know how to do. And I know if you live in the city, you don't have acres of space. But do you have a rooftop at your building that you have access to? If you do, that's a container farm right there. In a future podcast, I'll talk a lot about this because one of the topics near and dear to my heart is container farming in urban areas. But you'd be quite surprised by how much food you can produce in just a 5-gallon bucket on a rooftop or a fire escape or in your backyard. Cities don't produce food. And that means that we're much more fragile when it comes to cycles of catastrophe. But growing food encapsulates a lot of the other things I just mentioned in terms of what we should do. It promotes community. It gets you to know your neighbors. It helps you to prepare. It helps you with old skills. And also it literally provides food, which is, need I say it, the basis of life. No one's suggesting that we're going to be able to feed entire massive cities like New York City with just a few container farms. But you know what? We could do a lot more than we are doing. And it also would teach us to be less brittle, to depend less on systems that we know don't have our best interests at heart. Another thing you can do, move your money. Move your money out of banks. Go to credit unions, go to newer banks, go to smaller banks, go to banks where they guarantee you that they will not use your money for wild speculation, for promoting industries that are killing the planet, etc., etc. The way that our banking system is now is essentially a legalized and extremely high-stakes gambling organization. Divest from it. It's our money they're using. So don't give it to them. Something new is coming, but for this world, we are in the last days. We have to get ready, get together. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am.